we can get started with the discussion around the SIG group, and Sana and Kaushik is going to proceed with the SIG group 1, and they will share what progress has been already made with the SIG group 1. And continued with the SIG group 3, we would also have a discussion. Then we will have a chat on TSE as well. So with that, I give it to Sana and Kaushik to sort of take another 35-40 minutes and provide an update on what's happening in SIG group, and also talk about the future goals for the SIG group 1. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Kandan. We'll get started with the Sig Architecture and Requirements and where we are with the community progress, what we are doing, and how we are moving forward for release 1 and beyond. Currently, we have been able to establish bi-weekly meetings where we have a representation from a large number of vendors and service providers, and we are all working cohesively to gather the requirements, to understand the pain points and challenges for telcos in their journey of automation, and how we are developing some best practices and goals and principles to support the Nephio vision going forward as it becomes a community-driven effort and requirements coming from community in this as well. So in this effort so far, the progress that we have made, different service providers have contributed ideas in various different streams, but what actually made it to the realization of our R1 requirements. Some principles were presented by Kaushik and Bernard in one of our meetings, which happened on September 19th. And then after that, I had a proposal for the community to create a requirements gathering document in which a large number of companies actually contributed. About 8 companies provided their feedback on their near-term vision on what Nephio should support, the use cases that they want us to solve, and then the long-term vision on how Nephio should actually intersect with the rest of the ecosystem, their APIs with the not-bound systems, and how it has to give them a true value into their existing automation programs in their organizations. And we combined the customer requirements coming from all these different organizations, and we consolidated the user journey, and the user stories were refined for release 1. I will invite Kaushik to come in and give us a walkthrough of the user stories and give us a glimpse of our 1 and beyond release as well.
Thank you, Sana. Hello, everyone. So before we go to user stories, right, just a quick recap of the design principles and the design goals. And these are not new for most of you. These have been around since the formation of Nephio. But just to recap, we are talking about using Kubernetes concepts. So these are KRM, which is Kubernetes resource model, and configuration as data as the key mechanics of developing a common and consistent automation framework that spans across all the layers of the infrastructure that is used in a telecom network, right? So you're talking about infrastructure itself, which could be Kubernetes, could be any other hybrid cloud environment. Then you have network functions, which is the workloads that are being used for running the telecom infrastructure, and the configuration tied to the network functions, right? So all the 3 layers will have a consistent mechanics of using declarative constructs. The second part is key, which is, how do you handle dependency management across a suite of network functions, as well as the interplay that needs to happen between a network function and an infrastructure, right? So for example, you need to provision a user plane network function. It needs certain capabilities from the infrastructure. How do you ensure a consistent runtime mechanism to provision all the 3 layers in a consistent way as part of provisioning the workload itself? The third one is distributed actuation and reconciliation. I think this is a key aspect because it's not just intent-based automation, which is of course the key part of using Kubernetes principle, but being able to distribute that in a way that you can scale your infrastructure using the same principles without having to run into scalability channels, right? So the distributed actuation allows you to do that. And lastly, of course, with Nephio, we want to ensure that it's a user-friendly, simple way for any customers and any users of Nephio to be able to deploy and manage this automation framework. In terms of design goals, kind of borrowing from the design principles, what we want to achieve through the Nephio community, and this is where your participation is extremely valuable, is to standardize the Kubernetes custom resource definitions tied to infrastructure as well as for the network functions themselves. While we want to allow flexibility and extensibility for vendors to be able to extend beyond what the Nephio community defines for, the second part is defining interfaces and pluggability for Kubernetes operators that operate on the Nephio CRDs. So this allows the flexibility of using any vendor to develop their operators and plug into the Nephio defined CRDs and consume them effectively. And the last one is define an end-to-end automation framework for infrastructure orchestration, NF deployment, and configuration in a declarative manner. This is pretty much in line with the design principles. Coming to the user stories. So there was a lot of community input and exchange that happened in Sig Arc, leading to the definition of 3 user stories for R1. The first user story is functionally deploy free 5GC based network functions for 5G core, both control plane and user plane. The choice of free 5GC was driven based on ready availability without any significant dependencies in terms of licensing and operationalization. So it was an easy choice. And I think some of the work that the team has been doing here, you saw the demo, is kind of deriving from the choice of free 5GC that the community has adopted. The second part was both realizing day 1 and day 2 scenarios for automation. So the user story 2 is more about day 2, which is how do you horizontally and vertically scale the user plane? In this case, by the choice of 5G network core, we are talking about UPF. So being able to upgrade, let's say, the resources of an existing UPF instance, being able to deploy a new UPF instance for horizontal scalability. And in line with that, user story 3, which is scaling both horizontal and vertical for the control plane, which in this case happens to be SMF. Now, again, we are not necessarily strongly bounded by these user stories as the full scope. It really depends on how well the community engages and is able to work together towards the realization of these stories. But these 3 user stories form the crux of what we think are the key tenets for Nephio V1, which is to establish the automation framework in a consistent way across all the layers and be able to realize managing infrastructure to network function dependency through the constructs that we just talked about. Go ahead, John.
One thing we had talked about at one point was interaction between these two. So horizontally scaling the UPF and vertically scaling the SMF. Do you want to see that as part of our roadmap as well?
Yeah, so that's a good question. We have put it as a stretch. Yeah, so the question was network function dependency, interdependencies, right? So for example, scaling the UPF may need scaling of the SMF accordingly. And I think John's question is that in scope of Nephio R1? And the short answer is it is a stretch goal in terms of the immediate scope that we want to strive for is infrastructure and network function dependency management. That's the first level of scope. We do want to get to some level of inter-NF dependencies, just for your understanding. But how we achieve that and kind of what user journeys help us establish that is something that we still want to discuss. There was a great, there was one of the user stories which is not, being brought up here, which was bring up a new UPF, reconfigure an SMF, and be able to reconfigure a new APN to then also provision on the SMF. This was one of the user stories that was proposed. We don't yet know how much scope we can really achieve in the R1 release, so it is being discussed as a stretch goal, but something that will come back to the community if we think we can reasonably achieve. Does that help answer your question, John? All right. By the way, I might be going a little bit fast. Please do interject. I would like this to be a collaborative discussion. Any other questions, thoughts until now? Yes? These user stories have been discussed and finalized within the Sig Arc community and have been brought to the notice of the overall Nephio community. These are still in the process of being accomplished, to your point.
So it's been identified for development.
Correct.
All right, so I just didn't understand the word finalized, right? Because that means a little bit different to me. All right, and so we still have to define the associated triggers that would cause the scaling, for example, of a UPF versus SMF. That hasn't been identified yet, but we know we're finalizing the identification that we want to scale a UPF.
Absolutely.
Is that accurate? All right,
Absolutely.
thanks.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. When we say finalize, this is high-level scope of the user stories that the Sig community has finalized, but the specifics of both implementation and specifics of what triggers that lead to horizontal and vertical scaling in this case, these are all things that we need to discuss as a community.
Yeah, Kaushik, I have an input to that. So when we're talking about the network function to network function dependencies, especially when it comes to UPF to SMF, I think what we develop in the community, it would be important for us to apply the vendor extensions on the top, and a lot of information in this context has to come from vendors as well. Because I know from my experience that working with one vendor, their UPFs to SMF ratio for scale could be one thing, and for another vendor, it could be a totally different thing. So back to the principles, it's extremely important for us to maintain that extensibility when we apply that to multi-vendor context. But
Perfect.
something can be done there, right?
Yeah, thank you. I think this person had a question.
Thank you. So yeah, since 3.5GC very much like follows the spec, one could plug and play any other like UPF or whatever component here.
Absolutely. In fact, we would encourage vendors to bring their own network functions, help define the deploy CRDs for the network functions, define the operators, bring them to the Nephio community. This is, in fact, extremely encouraging for us if you could all, take the lead and help make that happen. But as a community, we are starting with 3.5GC, as and when vendors can help drive the rest of the, integration for their network functions, extremely valuable.
When you say you are looking from the vendors the integration between the UPF and the SMF, what do you mean? Okay, hello. My question is the integration between the UPF SMF. You are saying that you need information from the vendors, but there is good input about that regarding the interoperability among these the plane, the user plane, and the management function, which is 3GPP, where you can find that. So are you really looking by the integration, or are you looking for the code for the SMF and for the UPF?
So maybe, Sana, this was your input, which was, how do you want to take that part? You can answer from here.
So 3GPP has defined those relationships, but I think when it comes to the vendor-specific implementations, in my personal experience, I have seen that the implementation details can still vary. What we are talking about is that how many UPFs will actually require to trigger a new UPF instance. So the scale and how these vendors implement their solutions is very different. So it actually goes back to their capacity support and their scale questions on how their UPF is dimensioned and how their SMS is dimensioned around that. If that explains. 3GPP describes the specs on the relationships.
Yeah, if I can just say one or two things about that. So absolutely yes to what Sana just said. That, and what that means to me and why I'm bringing this up is that what I want out of the Sig Arch and out of the vendors is an understanding of how network designers would measure the capacity of these different things. So SMF, it talks about PDU sessions. What is it for UPF, and how do we know if a given UPF, how many PD, what is that relationship sort of on the information level so that we can build the CRDs in such a way that the consumption demands are made in terms of what the UPF capacity is, rather than in things like CPU, which is going to be different across every vendor. I agree with that. And, okay. Well, the other part was what I think was exactly what you're saying, that we can build an operator for 3.5GC. What that means is we can create something that takes the UPF deployment CRD and creates a config map that the 3.5GC pod can read and creates a deployment to manage 3.5GC pods. I have no idea what to do for a Nokia or an Ericsson or some other vendors. We would need their input and them to write those operators or They have existing operators, a lot of them. We would need to understand how to adapt it. So that's what we mean by other vendor participation. Yeah.
Regarding the relation of flow, it is the same for every single vendor.
Right.
The point about being vendor specific, okay, they are proprietary functions, okay, but the core of, or I would say not the core, but really the central point regarding the relations, the message flow, the signaling, it's there. Regarding the capacity of the UPF, how many sessions it can have, I absolutely agree, aligned.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I think we're totally, but that's exactly what we need is, I mean, like I've said multiple times on this summit, I'm not really a telco person, so what I'm thinking in terms of models and relationships between these entities without even knowing what they do. So like, but I want to make sure that the units, are the same. When I look at this interface between them, that the demand this is making is in the units that this supplies, right? That's kind of my level of thinking about it. So if the demand the UPF is making on the control plane is in terms of PDU sessions, which I don't know if it is, then that's good because the SMF capacity is being measured in terms of PDU sessions, and we can therefore create a vendor-neutral, standards-based understanding between the two.
Perfect. Thank you,
Awesome.
John.
Thank you.
And just to be clear, some of this might bleed across beyond R1, right? Like with R1, we can be a little bit more synthetic in terms of figuring out how to drive triggers for horizontal and vertical scaling of these NFs. But when you go to real world use cases, right? What are the triggers based on dimensions of your user plane, control plane, and so forth? What would be those triggers that drive the necessary outcome? I think that might be a level of sophistication that we drive beyond R1.
Hi.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Ling Li from China Mobile. I think this is really interesting, and since this is actually the first persons that I've been involved in this activity, so perhaps I have some very naive questions. So excuse me if it has been discussed in earlier discussions, but I would just like to know some of the clarifications of the scope of this project, not necessarily the release 1, but perhaps for further releases as well. So to start with, it seems that for release 1, you are targeting specifically on the single VNF orchestration and also configuration. So is it also in scope, perhaps in future releases, you would also include network service orchestration and configuration as well? Yes. This is my first question.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, sorry, your question was also, is R1 including a single network function? Is that what you are asking as well?
This is actually my assumption. If it is not accurate, please correct
Maybe
me.
what we should clarify is, in this case, we talked about both control plane and user plane network functions. So you'll talk about 5G, UPF, SMF, AMF as the fundamental set of NFs that we'll want to automate as part of R1.
The question is actually, do you orchestrate or configure these network functions one by one, or you actually are trying to orchestrate it and configure it as a collection of network functions as well as the connections between them?
Absolutely. In fact, it will be a collection. There will be an orchestration based on configuration of the interfaces that connect those network functions.
All right. So my next question is actually talking about the configuration part. So we all know that service providers are actually interacting with the element management systems from the vendors now to do the configuration. This is actually has been standardized at ADC for more than a decade, something like that. So is Nephio going to interact with the existing vendor element management system, or you are actually expecting all the vendors to actually to do the adaptation and shifting to you, the operators, as you would expect?
So there are two parts to your question, right? The fundamental construct of Nephio is operators, which are consuming the resources, the definitions for the resources, and then actuating the intent that has been expressed through the CRDs, right? Now, in terms of interactions with legacy systems, again, you should also chime in. But we do expect, depending on where you are in your journey as a network function vendor, you may have to, for actuation of the network function, do indeed talk to your legacy EMS, VNF managers, whatever be the infrastructure to do it. Over time, we expect those things to become cloud native. Sana did talk about how in Telesys world, you're looking at moving away from some of these constructs. We are not precluding from, completely avoiding those in R1, but over time we do expect in the general transformation journey of being cloud native that some of those constructs also go away, right? And in line with cloud native migration.
Yeah, perfect, Kaushik. I'll also supplement to some of the ideas that Kaushik described. I'll go back to first your question, the one that you talked about, the service level orchestration. This was one of my big curiosity in the early days of Nephio, that if it's replacing a VNF manager function, which has a scope of one CNF or one network function, can that be extended into the scope of a full service orchestrator where we build a topology on how various network function interfaces connect, and we describe that in NSD today, like the current state, how we do that. That can very well be done through operators of operators, and that's very much in scope of Nephio, which Kaushik already described. But I wanted to talk to you in your terms. Operators of operators can replace NSDs if we design it that way. Coming back to a second very important question, is that a lot of our existing network functions today have the analytics in a large number of proprietary EMSs. Those EMSs speak SNMP. There is no way SNMP can talk to Kubernetes, and we should not make that happen. So the best way for those EMSs is to adopt more cloud native models for the analytics. Something is Prometheus that we are working with a couple of vendors to bring their data on Prometheus so that Kubernetes can see those analytics. All the powerful things that we talked about in Kubernetes, that requires the visibility into the KPIs of your system. And if it cannot, then it cannot perform the lifecycle management capabilities, the reconciliation closed loop that we talked about. So in the future, there is a remote possibility that we could get the input from a universal Kafka into the Nephio. But again, to me, that kills the beauty of the Kubernetes and how we can actually achieve a lot of simplicity in this being in one of the native Kubernetes projects like Prometheus or something similar. So should not do it that way.
Okay, that actually goes to perhaps my next question is, now you're talking about configuration and orchestration, which talks about deployment. So are you also planning to taking in scope for the other, something like monitoring, the fault, the alarms, and all the closed loop, analytics, and also the feedback that you should expect from the existing element management system, and then feed into this operator or closed loop on the top? So would that be also part of release 1 for a single VNF, or it's going to be, somewhere else or in future releases?
So great question. Like by and large, I would say, given what we are targeting, and Kandan talked about the timelines for release 1 being early next year, we would like to kind of scope the effort for R1 accordingly. Given it's a relatively nascent community, we should all come together and make sure we scope it. Beyond that, if the community is really thriving, yes, things like productization, monitoring, alerting, definitely in scope. Other capabilities that we talked about, probably they are more for future releases, right? And we're happy to take inputs from the group.
Right, because we believe that this is critical. This is critical capabilities. So in addition to those basic configuration, because if you wanted to support a declarative API, whether or not it is at network service level or at a single VNF level, it is critical to know whether or not the VNF is actually running as you expected. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a declarative API at all.
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
In fact, one of the key things which is not probably being brought up here explicitly is there will be success matrix to ensure that whatever user stories we achieve will ensure the UPF or whatever the network function is fully functional in line with the requirements of that UPF, right, or that network function. So we will ensure through the right constructs, including monitoring, that the network function is indeed performing accordingly, both from a performance and functional capabilities.
Yeah, and I will try to supplement what you said on the alarming and the visibility of your performance to the upper stacks. So Kaushik has not yet gone to the future slides. There is a requirement that we have on the longer term roadmap where we will be working with community to build our node-bound APIs. So if there is a need that for the transition periods, we do need some visibility to upper layers of stack, that can be captured in our node-bound APIs definitions, which
Right.
includes the visibility to alarming KPIs, OSS, BSS, your network slicing components, your end-to-end orchestration components, your inventory components, we can capture that, and that's a part of the longer-term roadmap.
I see.
There was a question there as well.
Yeah, I have an issue here because basically you should really prioritize on what we are defining regarding the CRDs. The definition for the network functions. We are already speaking about FCAPs. I believe there is a confusion between what is infrastructure metrics and then what is OSS. And basically, it seems almost that we are going through the path of ONAP, that we wanted to do it all, and then in the end, we have big spaghetti. So I really would like to emphasize, and please be aware that there are critical challenges which Nephio could sort it out. And I speak with some persons yesterday evening, which basically is the definition of the network functions which can be used. I agree with some of you when said about the element management systems that we need to push the service providers really to move away to more cloud fashion situation. Completely agree, but do not deviate from what is the focus. Otherwise,
No, maybe if I can add, I agree with what he said, because I think, see, we can do many things here. I think there is a lot of potential, but we have to walk and then step by step, because if we try to do too many things in one go, we will probably fail. So I think and that's why in the user stories, I think what Shana and Kaushik wants to do is say, okay, what do we focus on for this release? And then we try to do that very well, and then we move on to the next thing. I think if we want to do too many things at once, we will have challenges probably, because in my view, the foundation, if we build the right foundation, we can build on top of it many different use cases, and if that is right, it will be a success. If we are going to go too fast, we will do too many things, not half-baked, and then the result is, it's like building a house, in my view. If the foundation is right, you can build on top, and then we can take it from there.
Absolutely.
Incremental.
I have one question. The question about the Lingley's question and then Sana's answer. I was on the impression the network service handling and using NSD, like Sana suggested before, that's not, my understanding is that's not part of the Nephio. That's the upper layer. So I thought like NFVO, that's why NFVO handling NSD, and that calling the Nephio to stitch out the network function connectivity and then affinity. That was my understanding, but someone said it's part of the scope of the Nephio?
So it's not captured in the release 1. It's up for discussion in the community to be captured in the future releases. I had a lot of side discussions with Tall. I don't know where Tall is right now. We were thinking if it's possible for us to have a connectivity from Tosca into Nephio, and one option that we have not put on the table, because like we discussed, we are trying to solve the simplest, lowest ground problems at the moment and trying to build incrementally. So whether we can replace the NSDs and all the existing NSDs model that exist in the industry, which are not perfect, Tosca is not perfect either, or we could replace that with one of the Google's proposed models like KRM and switch to that. Time will tell. I'll let Kaushik add more to that. I'm curious how the community will drive that forward, because I have lots of ideas and everything has pros and cons. Let's see how that grows.
I'll sort of second what Sana says. Like definitely in our original conception of Nephio, we knew that was way more than we could chew, and so we just ruled it out of scope. And but it's an open source community, and our original conceptions are just that, original conceptions, and the community will take it where it wants to take it. Now, I still believe in Wim's statement, like, yes, not only walk, we need to crawl, and we're not even crawling. We're like not even able to roll over yet, and you have a baby. So like, let's get there first. I think that being able to do that, I think it's clear to everybody when you see, here's the model. Just like it's clear, we're doing this because it was clear that Kubernetes built this model, and it worked well there. And not perfect, but it worked well there. we're going to take that model, extend it to this layer, and we can keep climbing that stack. And we can, but it's going to take years, and we'll figure it out together, and let's take it a little bit at a time. Yeah.
See, service orchestration is a big thing, right? Now, if you look to the 5G topology CRD that you created, it was not a single network function, right? If you look to the design of it at the moment, you could say there is 5 UPFs, I need them, there is a selector, if it goes to 5 clusters, you will get 5 UPFs. You could put an SMF in there, you could put an AMF in there. So we are already, if you look to the design of that CRD right now, I'm not saying that this is the right way, but if you look to the one that you consumed with the demo, we are already doing topology stuff. Is that full-blown service orchestration? Probably no, right? But you actually see already that you could, with one CRD, instantiate a full core, 5G core deployment, multiple elements, multiple SMF, multiple AMS, multiple UPFs. So the design of that CRD allows to do already something. I'm not saying everything, but pieces of it.
Understood. That is actually why comes this confusion. So we see that there is a potential that you guys can go either up or go, like wider horizontally, because you are actually mixing the Sig architecture by combining VNF manager and also part of element management systems functionality. And now is after you achieve your release 1 goals, then which way you would like to go? So this is actually my question. So you are taking in more element management systems so that you can actually close a loop at the VNF level, or you would like to go up and take consume the whole Mano stack. But as you know, that Mano is actually in a parallel with the EMS systems. So these are actually 2 approaches, which means the service providers, whether or not they should remain at the EMS system as well as the Mano system. Now we have Nephio as another alternative, so that we remain this architecture in the big picture, or we are actually not having, talking directly to the EMS system. Well, we talk to Nephio for all.
Yeah, sure. But I think, so it will be a journey probably, right? Because, see, you could consume, there's multiple ways to implement, right? You could basically create a CRD on top of an element management system, and a vendor does that, but you can also go direct. Or you could say, so these pieces we already do through KRM, right? And those pieces not, so you basically have both still in operation, and then over time, probably that percentage of what you still use in an element management system and what you do through Nephio KRM-based system will change over time. And that's probably, the user stories will help us determine which pieces and what that percentage will be, depending on the coverage that we'll have with that. But I think it's up to the community to decide which user story we want to go next upon, right?
Yeah. And I'll try to help solve some of your confusions, because I have been working in exact the same space. I'm working as a principal technology architect and have been working on service orchestration for like last 5 years or so. Have been following the ONAP community and have been working with a lot of industry products, and I work with Etsy, all of their APIs, along all the interfaces. I exactly know what you're talking about, the standards on which we have been pushing our vendors for the last many, many years, and the interfaces between the EMSs and the VNF managers, and working with these VNF managers to comply to SOL 3 APIs, and then we are working on SOL 005 APIs to interwork with our network slicing components. That's all there. That is the brownfield. Now, the idea of Nephio, as I can speak openly in this breakout room, I was in a talk yesterday, I didn't discuss that openly, but it's a little disruptive in nature, because the existing brownfield, as it's going, and the existing Etsy direction, as it has been going for the last many years, although the specs are very slow, and the vendor adoption to those specs is even slower. More than half of the VNF managers that I'm working with today are not compliant to the Etsy APIs. Even if the 2 vendors are Etsy APIs compliant, I still have to spend 3 weeks of integration work with them. So the idea of Nephio is actually challenging the status quo. And we need to see how we can experiment with this, how we can actually play with this in a way that can improve our state from what we are in today to a very cloud-native state. Telcos have had a history of over-standardizing, and that's what we did with the APIs too. And the cloud native world, as it's evolving, doesn't speak the same protocols, they don't speak the same language, they want to replace APIs for our protocols, they want to do the things differently. And it's a different vision, it's a different approach to solve the same problems, and we don't know if it's going to replace Etsy yet, or it's going to become a part of Etsy. Maybe there is one possibility that somebody proposed to me that a CNFD, which currently describes a Helm chart, could actually use an operator, and we can make a CNFD wrapper on the top, and the whole brown field can exist as is. So we don't want to decide this right now. I think we want to leave it to the community to see how this plays out and how we are adopting it and how we are feeling about this adoption. And then we decide how this will move forward. That's the beauty of open source, right? We can evolve it to be something that makes sense in our context, in our times.
Perfect. Thank you, Sana. Thank you.
I don't know.
Go ahead,
I was summoned using the magic word, Tosca, so I came up.
So you could not stop.
But should I say some more about this, or do we want to move to another topic?
Please express your ideas on Tosca.
Sure. well, nice to see you, Lingli. It's a good question about the scope, right? We talked about it from the start, network services, the stitching together. So I'll say a few things about it. I mean, Tosca is great, of course, for me. I'm working hard on Tosca 2.0. But the nice thing about Tosca, relationships are first-class citizens. There's a topology. KRM doesn't have that out of the box, but it doesn't mean we can't think that way and think of certain entities as relationships connecting. So I'll say there are three issues. One, it's out of scope to do network service orchestration for us because we want to run a tight ship. We want to solve specific problems. Unix philosophy, right? Identify a gap, solve it. Here's an operator that does it. Use 10 Nephio operators if you want, or 5, whatever works for you. I would even say if we only have 5 operators that work well for everybody, I would call that a smashing success for Nephio, if we can reduce costs and simplify the delivery of network functions. But that said, it doesn't mean we can't think and design. This is why we have a separate SIG for architecture, where we design the CRDs thinking that there will be a surface orchestrator connecting it, right? So we can think that way, right? You're familiar, of course, with Etsy and the idea of virtual links. I'm not sure that's the best example to copy, but we can think of ways, we are designing the network functions in our SDK that will be used to create these operators with the idea that they will be connected. How they will be exactly connected, we're not sure yet. This is going to have to involve it in SIG number 1. But I will say that there are multiple levels of it too, right? So the stitching together on the one hand is the abstract building of the topology with the configurations. But there are other challenges that are low level. Networking in Kubernetes is an evolving paradigm. Right? I work quite a bit on this. I think we're all settled with using Multis for connecting the data planes and the exotic and special networks that we need sometimes. But the stitching together is still, we know, very, very much a struggle at scale. Right? Multis is based on CNI configurations that you need something to actually write them for you. You cannot write them individually and package and expect it to just work. So I think that's the kind of thing that I believe should be in scope in Nephio. But again, it's me, right? This is a community. Together we'll decide, what the priority is to work with it. 2, all right, we have 2 votes for Multis Part 2. All right, but yeah, 3. I think a lot of us understand that this is a gap. We're identifying gaps, and we don't want to reinvent wheels, right? If there's an orchestrator or a product that already does it for you, if there's an OSS system that does it, I agree very much with some of the sentiments said here. We don't want, I at least think we don't want to come in and say, you have to throw away your 10-year investments in orchestrators and rip that all out and replace it with Nephio. The idea, I think, is to fill in gaps that we know exist in Kubernetes, identify them with surgical precision, and write a tool that specifically solves that. And if you combine those together, then you have a narrative that you can wrap into your own narrative solution for your orchestration. And one size does not fit all. I think we all know this, and I think it will be silly to try to create something that will assume will work for every telco, for every vendor, for every provider. But again, going back to that way of thinking, if we make sure that the interfaces are there to be stitched together, something else will be doing the stitching, in my view. Maybe 5 years from now, Nephio really matures and we can say we feel confident that we can create a service orchestrator based on it. But I don't see any reason why we have to boil the ocean from the start. We probably won't succeed, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And if it solves the very fundamental problem of how we are interacting with the cloud and how we are deploying our functions to the cloud and how we are consuming the cloud, I think some of the brownfield stack that exists in standards today could actually be benefiting from this efficiencies. Imagine network slicing. If a lot is happening in the cloud in a cloud native way, there is so much less stress on that layer to actually manage and maintain. So I believe Nephio is going to simplify a lot of our higher level stacks and make it easier for them to do the job. Because the problem is not there, the problem is at the lowest levels of how we are working with the cloud right now in deployments and configurations and managing and scale. Because the telco standards had not seen cloud the way it grew and the way it evolved.
Perfect. Thank you. How are we doing on time?
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, but like I also don't want. So this is more of a placeholder. This is some of the input that we have received from the community, but this is not at all an exhaustive list. This is really where the Sig Arch and the rest of the community members should be discussing about how should we evolve beyond R1, how should we phase out the next set of problems and gaps which exist. And I'm fully with Tal and some of the others, right? Like with R1, what we're trying to do is even prove to ourselves that the concepts of KRM and CAD can indeed be applied for network function automation, right? We do believe, but in the end, we need to make it happen on the ground. And that's kind of the guiding principle, at least in my opinion, before we go too big and fan out too much. I can, of course, go through this list, but it might be, I don't know, do folks prefer to kind of talk it through if you have more ideas about what we should be doing, or do you prefer that we kind of walk through this and, talk about some of the ideas that have come about? Yeah, so, yeah, so first on the left-hand side, maybe these buckets may not be well labeled, but things that we have talked about, and you've heard this in the previous talks, multi-cloud. It's an important capability that we want to solve for. Multi-vendor network functions. A typical heterogeneous network in a telco is a common paradigm, right? We are looking at free 5GC, but we want to get to a multi-vendor approach pretty soon. Multi-domain. We are starting with 5G core, but we want to look at the whole gamut of RAN, transport, IMS, wireline, and so forth, right? And this is not necessarily looking at all of those functions, but more about building extensibility of Nephio so that it can then evolve to be a multi-domain orchestrator, right? As an example. Day zero focus. I think I heard some of you talk about, free 5GC, the demo that we did, where we had multiple NFs being instantiated as part of, being specified as part of a single CRD. You can take this to the other extreme. You can say, hey, I want to be able to completely formulate my network design through a CRD, which you can specify higher level constructs. And then that downstream to the same concept that Sana was mentioning, right? You can have a operator of operator that consumes a top level CRD, does the fan out to the next set range of operators, and you can have potentially multiple trees in that paradigm, right? So all of these are, again, we don't need to necessarily solve point problems in those scenarios, but being able to establish a network design that can be extensible to solve such a hierarchical concept, right? Lifecycle management of slices and other higher level services, right? Again, some of that falls into service orchestration, range of things. But again, these are ideas that have come about from some of you. Large scale deployment, scalability, productization at large scale. I think this is in fact a key concept, because what we are looking at R1 is more of a functional capability, but taking that, productizing it, and making it real in a production-like environment, if not prod environment, is kind of an important concept, because the goal of Nephio is being able to realize the benefits. Hey, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm interested in this Helm and Young to Nephio CRD converter. Is that sort of feasible, possible at all?
I think maybe, Wim, you want to give your thoughts since you've played at some of this?
Yang to CRD, I actually implemented myself, so I can say yes. And it's Yeah, so it's auto-generated even. So you actually give a yang and it auto-generates CRD. So you can do that. Helm I did not do myself yet, but see, Helm is you have to probably match the values and stuff like that. So Helm is a bit of a different kind, because if you look at cat config as data, it actually has KRM resources, and Helm has also KRM resources, and then you have basically an API on top of it. So if I look to Helm, if I would, my personal view in the context of Nephio, what I would do is, if we define the right CRDs, you map your values into a CRD. No? We need to discuss that.
This is the point of this maybe contention among some of us. Like, I think the problem with Helm is every single package is its own API, and it's got no schema, and it's completely has no contract. So you can't build a converter because you don't know what you're converting from or to. So we could build tools that help vendors that have existing Helm packages create map their values files into CRDs potentially if they follow certain conventions, but they're just tools to help that process. They're not converters.
John, one quick question. When I was in Google in June timeframe, I was told Google is cooking internal tool converting between Helm chart to CRD. I was that under impression. I'm not sure that's the clear understanding.
Yeah, that
no.
I not that I know of. I mean, I do know actually Brian Grant, who's sort of the
your chief
patron saint of our configuration as data.
Your chief architect said maybe something. Okay.
Well, he has some ideas around that, but whether they're viable or not isn't clear.
Okay.
I think we got two hands.
I'd be inclined to agree with you. I think Helm doesn't really have any structure, so probably the best way to do a one-way ticket. Bit of Bash, bit of Python. Each person will have their own. Each person company will have their own structure for their own stuff. Do a one-way ticket, and that's probably how you have to do it. That's how I'd probably do it if I was doing it.
Actually, your point, I think, is like he just said something that made me think is right. If once they convert to CRDs, you could generate the Helm charts out of the CRD structures, but the other way around is very hard to do.
The only thing I would like to caution us is that if we're just converting and moving complexity from one YAML format to another YAML format, what did we gain?
Exactly. Agreed.
So I agree. I will say I'm no fan of Helm, but we talked about this before. I did a demo a few weeks ago for the automation. We have a lot of ideas, a lot of POCs. Eventually, we're converge on something or multiple somethings. We don't even know if there should be one way of doing things or we should support multiple ways. So it's part of why you're here, and we hope to get you more involved in the community and more opinions and feedback. But regarding Helm, I personally hate Helm. I think generating YAML with text manipulation is a terrible idea, but it exists. Huge investments. Again, let's not throw investments that we have. What I showed in a demo is that you can use Helm. At the end of the day, Helm generates Kubernetes manifests. Tosca toolchain you can have before that also generates manifests. So you can use kept to generate these manifests. You can use Argo CD to generate these manifests. The point is that once you have those manifests, you do need to distribute them somehow. So I showed an example of you can have a meta scheduler that can take these resources and make sure that they're placed in the right place at the right time. You can generate that with Helm. You can generate it with Tosca. You can use anything else you want higher in the toolchain. So I don't think we need to absolutely replace our investments in packaging tools that our favorite packaging tool.
Along those lines, actually, there's a kept function that renders a Helm chart. So that if you have an existing Helm chart, you can wrap it in kept and put a schema on top of it. And of course, if you change your Helm chart, you've got to change your function invocation. But it's visible to the external user.
I wrote this Tosca operator for Kubernetes that lets you use Tosca directly in Kubernetes. And I have a Tosca node type called a Helm chart. So you could take the Helm chart and actually encapsulate it in Tosca and use that as well. So we can mix and match things. But I agree, there's no real advantage of translating one format to the other. It's about integrating our existing investments and not throwing them away. I think it's possible. Please. Yeah.